All right, we last left the lecture with Hitler just coming to power. A few weeks into Hitler's rule, the Reichstag, the German parliament building, was set on fire. Now, many historians believe the fire was the work of Hitler's people. It was the answer to an aspiring dictator's prayers. Hitler now had an excuse to crush the communists who, he said, set fire to the Reichstag. Now, whether it was the communists or the Nazis, we know it wasn't Billy Joel. Billy Joel didn't start the fire. I'm sorry, it's hard to work in humor into a lecture about Hitler, so I'm just kind of grasping at straws here. Anyway, Hitler had an excuse to crush the communists, silence moderates, and create laws giving him sweeping new powers. Suddenly, there was no middle ground. You were either with Hitler or against Hitler. He followed a playbook that has inspired dictators ever since. Hitler proceeded to consolidate his power in the most ruthless ways. He locked up the few courageous politicians who voted against him and established his total control of the German government. Those who tried to fight his power grab were quickly silenced as they were arrested, sent to concentration camps, and executed. The rise of Hitler was done with two things. One is fascination, the other is terror. Basically, give people something that they can believe in by false promises. The other thing is whoever does not fit in will get beaten up or put in prison or killed. A lot of the Third Reich was based on violence or the implied threat of violence. In fact, Hitler had a private army that basically gave him the power of terror on the streets. He had a big protection of his political movement, and of course people knew about concentration camps in Germany for political enemies. They were supposed to know, so that they would keep their mouths shut. Hitler hijacked Germany's democracy. He was given extraordinary powers to temporarily suspend democratic procedures in order to get things done. A dictator now in charge of a mighty industrial nation, Hitler and his team laid out their plan for Germany and the world. Inheriting a German economy suffering from the Great Depression, including an unemployment rate of 30%, Hitler quickly turned to improving the economy. He accelerated the previous government's policy of a large public works program and infrastructure projects, financed with deficit spending. As a result, employment increased dramatically from 1933 to 1936. The Autobahn is the best-known example of this kind of program. The Autobahn was the highway construction program that gave a lot of jobs to people. The Autobahn was actually invented before the Nazis, but the Nazi acceleration of the Autobahn brought Germany into a more modern age. Now, Germany didn't have the money to do this. Again, this is deficit spending. And once they were built, the Autobahn, the highways were empty because hardly anyone could afford cars. Despite the focus on jobs and the German worker, Nazis had no use for labor unions. They were not within the frame of the fascist movement. So what the Nazis did 1 year into their government is they declared May Day a holiday for the first time. May Day was kind of like the Labor Day of that time. The unions celebrated May Day, and the next day, when they were hungover basically, Nazis smashed the unions. They replaced the now abolished unions with the Nazi party-controlled German Labor Front, which all workers had to join. Hitler spent large amounts of state money on a comprehensive state welfare program called the National Socialist People's Welfare. Now, I want to take a step back and make sure I mention this. Despite having the term socialist in the party name and in some of their programs, Hitler was not a socialist as we might think of today. Hitler was a friend of industry. He privatized many industries, and the corporations that had supported his candidacy continued to support him. Corporations supported the Nazis because it was good for their profits. The steel industry was a big one. They were afraid of communism, but they supported Hitler because it was easier for them to make their business within a stable government. One German industry that bloomed was the auto industry, and one of the most famous cars was born during the Nazi era. That's right, the Volkswagen. The Volkswagen was an affordable car for everybody that would fill the Autobahn. With the industrial activity and employment, Hitler began to re-energize Germany. Much of Germany was swept up in Hitler's charismatic vision, and the country had a common purpose. Everywhere he went, it seemed, crowds adored him, women swooned when his car drove by. In clubs called the Hitler Youth, boys and girls pledged their allegiance to him. Hitler became known by a new title, which meant he was their leader, their Führer. He also established himself as a bit of a new god for Germany. Germany was not really part of a democracy anymore. He was a godlike figure. And a fascist system needed a Führer, the big hero, the saint. It's the one and only thing that people believe in. He had the vision for ethnic Germans. Now, the idea about fascism was to have a big community that all operated the same way and had a common opinion that covered all. And the phrase, the party slogan, if you will, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, embodied this. Ein Volk, one people. Ein Reich, one government. Ein Führer, one leader. That Führer being, of course, Hitler. Individuality was deemed unfit for a German. So what mattered was the Volksgemeinschaft, the society, the common denominator of the German people. All people who tried to make it any different in their private life, in their profession, in the way to express their opinions, they had to be stopped. For the Nazis, the city that most embodied their sense of national unity was Nuremberg. Nuremberg was nicknamed the most German of German cities. That's one reason it was a favorite of Hitler's to showcase his nationalistic pomp and pageantry to inspire all of Germany to get on board. It was in Nuremberg that Hitler declared the Third Reich, a powerful German empire to last 1,000 years. It was the Nuremberg Zeppelin field that Hitler made the site of his huge Nazi rallies. For several years, increasingly elaborate celebrations of Nazi culture, ideology, and power took place in the Zeppelin field. Fascist dictators understood the propaganda power of big rallies, where they could manufacture the adoration of their people, bask in it, and broadcast it to the rest of the population. Hitler said these rallies turned the little man into the part of a great dragon. In 1934, German filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl recorded a Nuremberg rally. This became the basis for her film Triumph of the Will, which was broadcast in every German school and even played in movie theaters. You can probably watch sections of it on YouTube. It is probably the classic example of Nazi propaganda. Despite its veneer of respectability and popularity, the thriving fascist state relied increasingly on brutal repression. Hitler continued his ruthless creation of a totalitarian fascist state. The free press was silenced, as were intellectuals and universities. The Nazis' approach to intellectuals was to dismiss them from having their jobs. They played no role in the state. And remember, fascism is all about the power of the state. A good way to describe it is if you compare Nazis and communists. One historian has mentioned the comparison between Nazis and communists like this. A communist needs a bookshelf for Marx and Engels, Lenin, and dozens of other books from the communist intellectuals. A Nazi's bookshelf was Mein Kampf, and that's basically it. The Nazi approach to art was the same, only one style was acceptable. The Nazi approach to art was pretty simple. It had to be as naturalistic as possible, featuring beautiful, blonde, blue-eyed people doing field work. When you look at these pictures, you see the perfect German family according to the Nazis. Again, tall, blonde, blue-eyed, beautiful, great shape. This is the idealized version of the German people. Anything that would question society or bring society forward, which art is able to do, would just be deemed subversive, unnatural, or un-German. Nazis were very much against modern art. In May 1933, after Hitler had been chancellor for just a couple of months, was the burning of the books across Germany. Books that caused people to question the Nazi agenda were forbidden and publicly burned with delight by Hitler supporters. The books of left-wingers, psychologists, books by Jewish writers would be publicly burned in ceremonies. Now, let's say you owned some of those books. You didn't want your books being burned. You kept them on your shelf. You didn't participate in the book burnings. And let's say you have people over to your house. They see your bookshelf. They see those books. They can have an argument against you as being subversive because you have those books in your private library. And even if you were, not with a family, but maybe you were a single person, you have a roommate, they have an argument against you. There's no trust in anyone any longer after the burning of the books. As a famous German writer said, once you're burning books, very soon you're going to burn people. Artifacts and posters illustrate the Nazi notion of a master race. Anyone who didn't fit into their model could be viewed as an enemy of the state sent to concentration camps. The Nazis required those they imprisoned to wear badges that identified their status: political traitor, lawbreaker, foreigner, gypsy, homosexual, asocial, anyone who would not conform. And of course, the Yellow Star of David went to Hitler's lowest of the low, the Jews. The Nazis believed that ethnic Germans were the master race. They should be running the planet, but couldn't because of the Jewish world conspiracy. If ethnic Germans dealt with that Jewish conspiracy, they could achieve their rightful status again. The Nazis started putting anti-Semitic ideas into action as early as April 1933, when they organized a boycott of Jewish businesses. Hitler specifically blamed the Jewish people for ruining things for everyone else. In November 1938, the Nazis led a pogrom against Jews throughout Germany. During Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, Jewish homes, hospitals, and schools were ransacked. 7,000 Jewish businesses were damaged or destroyed, and over 1,000 synagogues were burned. 30,000 Jews were arrested and put in concentration camps. This was a turning point from earlier economic, political, and social persecution to physical beatings, incarceration, and murder. It was the beginning of Hitler's final solution. And the evils of fascism were incremental. As small evils became big evils, German society managed to be oblivious of their own atrocities. At first, concentration camps contained nonconformists. Then they became forced labor camps. Eventually, the Nazis built death camps, which were located outside of Germany and therefore farther from public view. With what the Nazis called the final solution, the entire Jewish population was targeted for extermination. In total, Nazis murdered about 6 million Jews. 2.7 million or so of those died in death camps. Auschwitz Birkenau in Poland was the biggest and most notorious camp in the Nazi death camp system. Now today, it might seem unusual, but it is a tourist site. Survivors of the Shoah, or the Holocaust, want people to go there so that the atrocities are never forgotten. In fact, it's required in Germany to go to learn from one of those death camps. In fact, you can follow Auschwitz on Twitter, and every day they post photographs of people who were imprisoned there and most often murdered. They tell you their fates, what happened to them. It tells you a little bit about them. Once inside the gates of Auschwitz, or any death camp, inmates were worked to death or executed. New arrivals were sorted into two categories: those who would be sent to the gas chambers immediately, and those who could work, who would live a little bit longer. Inmates rarely survived more than a couple of months. Up to 1,000 people, each tattooed with an ID number, were packed into buildings that served as makeshift dormitories. The gas chambers, where the mass killings were done, were disguised as showers. People were given hooks to hang their clothes on, conned into thinking they were coming back. The Nazis didn't want to create a panic. They just made everything seem normal. Then the inmates piled into the shower room. In this facility, the Nazis gassed and cremated over 4,000 people per day. How is this enforced? The Gestapo, the secret police, and the elite SS force enforced Nazi rule. Government employees managed the Nazi state and coordinated its most ruthless activities. The efficient and heartless bureaucracy behind Hitler's crimes gave rise to the expression, the banality of evil. This was just everyday life. Pencil pushers, paper pushers, in the Nazi regime. Fascism continued to spread, and its militarism threatened peace in Europe. But again, we'll talk about that with World War II. There was a man named Martin Niemöller, who had served in a German U-boat in World War I. He actually refused to give up his U-boat to England, and was discharged from the German Navy. After the war, he began seminary training at the University of Munster, and when the Third Reich came to be, he welcomed them. But then he met Adolf Hitler in 1934. It became clear at the meeting that his phone had been tapped by the Gestapo, the secret police, and the Pastors Emergency League, which he had helped to found, was under state surveillance. He came to see the Nazi regime as a dictatorship, and decided to oppose it. He felt that ordinary Germans had been complicit through their silence in the Nazi imprisonment, persecution, and murder of millions. And he wrote this. It's now kind of become, easily parodied. But I think if we put it in the context of the time, it's actually pretty powerful. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. In full disclosure, I think it took me about 20 tries to get through that. This episode was extraordinarily long. The next one is going to be actually pretty short to try to balance things out. One thing I do want to remind you of is the film, the documentary, that was put out by the Holocaust Museum, and it is probably one of the best quick explanations of the Nazi regime and the Holocaust. And if you haven't been, visit the Holocaust Museum whenever normal life returns. It is far and away one of the most powerful museums in America. And if you get a chance, make sure to check out the quick lecture on Spain and Francisco Franco.